Build my home on hollow ground. Too proud to grow.
Hi, this is Craig Smith with a new podcast about artificial intelligence. As regular listeners know, besides understanding basic research in the field, I'm interested in understanding what's happening in AI research in various parts of the world. I've done episodes about China, about Russia, about Europe and Africa. This week I look at India, which, with its massive population, fast-growing economy, English language education, and large supply of brilliant researchers and engineers, one would expect to be competing with China and the US for dominance in the space. However, it's not. Many of its best and brightest technologists live abroad, where they populate elite research institutes and lead some of the world's biggest tech companies. To understand why and what's happening in India, I talked to Partha Talukdar, a professor at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, where he's a founding director of the Machine and Language Learning Lab. Partha, the son of bankers, grew up in the northeastern Indian state of Assam, but did his undergraduate degree at the Birla Institute of Technology and Science in Pilani. He moved to the University of Pennsylvania to pursue his PhD, and together with Tom Mitchell, Partha was one of the architects of the never-ending language learning system at Carnegie Mellon, which has been pouring through hundreds of millions of web pages nonstop since 2010, learning semantic relationships and accumulating knowledge. I'm delighted to have Partha on the show.
Cross it to find your synthetic light.
I talk to a lot of people about China. Everyone is obsessed with China.
Right.
India is the other massive population base.
Sure.
You go to conferences, you look at the CEOs of tech companies, there's an overabundance of Indians.
Right.
Why don't we hear about AI in India the way that we do about AI in China or
Right.
even Russia?
Right. So, there's a long history of AI in India. So the courses and the research, I think the first courses in AI in India started in 1960s or so. And then there's a long history in doing research in artificial intelligence. So I guess things have been going on, but with the resurgence and the scaling up in various parts of the world that we have seen is still work in progress in India, right? Of course, you will see Indian researchers all over the world contributing to AI research. I guess your question is AI research coming out of India.
Yeah, exactly. Because a lot of the researchers are attached to international institutions, particularly
right.
American institutions.
Right.
So one question is about the basic research.
Mm-hmm.
The other is the startup ecosystem in India.
Right.
Is, again, I know that there are things happening in
Right.
India, and certainly there's some very famous companies that
Right.
have come out of India.
Right.
But not to the extent that you hear about things out of China or the United States.
Right. Yeah, so I guess there are multiple aspects and dimensions that we can look at. So in terms of just academic research, so there are good pockets of very high quality work that's being done in the country, but the volume of it, right, and the number of it is not proportionate to the size of the country. So we have work to do in terms of scaling that up. Now, in terms of the student population and academics, so there is, India is a very young country in terms of population, and there are various statistics about 50% of the population is less than 25 years of age now, and the average age is going to be also next few decades going to be on the younger side. So there is strong appetite among the student population to learn AI, to contribute and become tool themselves up in this particular area. So more than a top-down scenario, in terms of planning and AI in the country, I would see there is much more activity in the bottom-up fashion, much like lots of other things in the country. So there is a strong interest in terms of finding data science talent. When I talk to industrial partners, they look to India again. I mean, as you probably know, Bangalore is a strong computer science IT hole, which has been kind of in the traditional areas, but increasingly even to find data science talent, people are looking to Bangalore kind of as a go-to destination to find talent. As you could imagine, there is a crunch in talent in those areas. So there is lots of bottom-up interest and upskilling of people, both new students who are kind of graduating, but also within the IT industry, large number of engineers who are kind of traditionally doing the regular software development, and now they are interested in coming into AI. And from that perspective, there are lots of support, and ecosystem has been kind of developing to upskill themselves. So that's kind of the education and training part of it. Many of the major universities have also introduced a program specifically focused towards AI. For example, in my university, University of Science, from this year, we are starting an MTech specially focused on AI. And there are a few other places like that as well. Now, on the startup and the industry side of things, I mean, there is also lots of young companies and startups that are coming out, which are AI first, right? So where kind of AI is not an afterthought, but their main product itself is focused on AI and heavily relies on that. Myself included, so even though I have a faculty position, but also to translate some of our research, I also founded a company on my own, a startup called Kinome, which is trying to help enterprises make sense of unstructured data through knowledge graphs, things like that. So so there is lots of activities around there. I would say kind of in terms of the fresh startups and relatively large-scale startups, which have been around for a few years, and have been kind of collecting data by offering various services, they are also increasingly more interested in utilizing AI to improve their product. And there's lots of interest around there. Yeah.
And we're talking about machine learning specifically.
Yes. Right.
Are there, we all know Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba, Amazon, Google, Uber, Apple, all of the big tech firms in the U.S. and China.
Right.
Are there the AI research giants in the private sector in India, and who are they?
So in the industry in AI is represented, or industry in India is represented by these kind of large multinational organizations. Pretty much you can kind of name any company, they would have a strong tech presence in India. So apart from that, there are kind of the regular Indian conglomerates and large businesses that have traditionally been around and have also some technical branches like, say, Tata Consultancy Services, Infosys. These are large-scale IT services companies. Yeah. And then you have the startups that have kind of are homegrown and competing with many of these multinationals that you mentioned. For example, in the e-commerce space, we have Flipkart, which was recently acquired by Walmart. Then there are other upcoming SaaS-based startups like Freshdesk and food delivery services called Swiggy. So these are, I guess, kind of in terms of size, still not as large as those the Chinese counterparts that you are talking about, but they are kind of the dominant players in their respective areas. So they have been through their services and offerings, have been kind of collecting data, because in order to do machine learning and AI, you need kind of a data as a first-class object. And now that they have been kind of running for a while, collecting all this data, there is kind of lots of interest and investment in utilizing that data to improve their services.
Yeah, and that's something I wanted to ask you, because certainly I don't know if it's as much as China, but it's very well known, the massive data collection activities or enterprises or whatever the word is, innovations in India, the fingerprint, the
Aadhaar,
biometrics.
yes,
and
right.
So there's tremendous data being collected that's held, presumably by the government.
Yes.
Is that made available to private enterprise, or is there a counterpart like Facebook or Amazon in the private sector that's also sweeping up huge amounts of data?
So the Aadhaar, the biometric system that is kind of like maintained, developed by the government, and it's maintained by the government for the identification and authentication purposes. Those are, I guess, kind of like available in some limited capacity to certain kind of like sectors. For example, for banking, if you want to do some sort of authorization in some limited way, you can get validation whether a particular person's identity is same as what they are saying that they are, whatever they are kind of like proposing their identity to be. So they can validate in those limited contexts. But there are kind of like lots of discussions and litigations also going on in terms of like how to utilize this data set, and of course privacy remains a very strong concern of that. Yeah.
The government, you were saying it's bottom up. China is decidedly top down. Well, also bottom up, but it's got a very focused top down approach. The U.S. has a top-down approach in some sectors, largely coming out of the defense sector through DARPA and things like that. But there isn't the kind of national strategy that exists in China. Is there in India that kind of a national strategy top-down to drive ML development?
Right. So there was a policy document or a suggestion, a draft was put up last year by what is called as Niti Aayog as the AI policy for India. So it's called like AI for all. They have identified certain sectors to kind of like focus on that. Also focus both on the basic research and kind of like the translational aspects of that. So so that just came out last year, and I guess kind of like various suggestions that were being made in that particular document are currently being worked on to implement those in terms of...
In China, the government, I mean, it's still very much command and control economy. The government has tremendous financial resources, so they spend like crazy when they focus on something like this. I mean, they built the world's largest high-speed rail network in record time. So there's that money that goes down, but it also triggers regional governments and municipal governments to come up with their own programs, and they start spending. So there's a tremendous flow of capital through the government into research and development and the startup ecosystem. And is there money flowing down from the top like that in India?
Right. So, I mean, traditionally, funding in India, or at least like, the well-recognized universities are kind of like well-funded by the government, and increasingly there is funding from the private sector as well. So funding for kind of like regular research has not been that much of an issue. And also the students are covered in terms of fellowships and the tuition by the government. But I guess like in terms of scaling it up significantly, right, we kind of like more resources and investments are necessary. I'm hoping that some of these kind of like policy and works in progress will kind of like contribute towards that. I mean, there is an effort to have like a nationwide upgradation of the infrastructure for computing, to have kind of like a grid-style supercomputing or distributed infrastructure, so that like computing is not a bottleneck in terms of whoever wants to do innovation in this space. But I think we need more researchers and more people already skilled in this area to kind of like find their base in the country, and then kind of like form groups locally and then propagate that. So while there has been most of the students in India kind of like go abroad to kind of like for their higher studies, although in the recent years there has been kind of like a trickling back effect, I guess like that we need to accelerate to kind of like create opportunities for people who are abroad, who are kind of like already experts in this area, to come back at least partially or fully, and then like contribute towards the ecosystem in the country.
And you're an example of that.
I am an example of that, but I kind of came back out of my own kind of like personal reasons. But I think we should also create professionally attractive opportunities for people who belong to this category. From whatever I have heard, China has done quite aggressive and attractive positions of this kind for people to come back. And I think we need to have more along those lines to create those kind of opportunities for people.
I mean, one of the things that's drawn people back to China, besides the national policy, is a booming economy.
Yes.
Does that play a factor in India?
I think that has been one of the positive factors in terms of the booming economy. And so there is kind of like lots of opportunities to both from kind of like a scientific perspective, but also in terms of business opportunities, right? Because India maybe has a little bit of a different setup in terms of its diversity. So there is like huge linguistic, cultural diversity. But the problems in terms of education, healthcare, because it's kind of like still a developing country. So all of those things are also major, massive problems, right? So one of the big opportunities there is how we can, say, use AI to kind of like leapfrog from the traditional solutions towards making, say, healthcare more affordable to people in rural areas. So who cannot, say, take a day or multiple days off from their work to go to the city to kind of get themselves tested or get themselves treated. So how can, say, AI do remote health monitoring so that at least for the basic screenings, right, they don't have to miss their work, and at least for the major ones they can come there. So similarly for educations, finding quality teachers to educate this massive population is not going to be available, is not available now, and it's not going to change anytime in the near future, right? So having a purely manual approach is not going to work. So again, can we use AI and technology, because the need is immediate and we cannot wait a decade or two to actually find a solution for that. So that way, I think there is massive opportunities to kind of have an impact using machine learning AI in these areas. And I think the policymakers and the government also sees this as an opportunity. But of course, more work needs to happen there.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the cultural and linguistic diversity.
Right.
Has that been an impediment to date in developing India as an AI or machine learning powerhouse?
Right. So in terms of training and higher education, most of it is still done in English. So from that training perspective, probably that hasn't been as big of a problem. But what I was saying earlier was kind of the economic and societal impact opportunity that's there using AI. But at the same time, from a research perspective and technology development, having this diversity creates both maybe opportunities and challenges, right? Because say if you have a deep learning speech recognition model, right, that requires 10,000 hours of speech data to be to train your model on. But in India, there are 22 major languages, 22 official languages, and 200 major languages, and 1,500 plus other languages, right? So you're not going to have as much, high quality, large volume data to train all of these models on, right? So that also throws up new research opportunities, right? So how do you kind of say build better transfer learning model to do this speech recognition better or language processing better in all of these languages, right? So now, say if we take the example of e-commerce, right? So I gave example of say, Flipkart and all. So traditionally, given kind of the business opportunity, they started with the major cities to kind of serve the customer in those areas. But now they are moving to tier 2, tier 3 cities where English is not the predominant language, right? So people want to converse and place orders and discuss using their local languages. So from a business perspective also, the importance of these languages are becoming more important. So in addition to, while the government has been supporting technology development in these local languages over the years, but now I also see increasing interest from the industry to actually support research and develop technologies because there is a business need.
I had an interesting episode with a fellow named Liang Huang from Baidu Research about simultaneous translation work that he's doing. Right. And as well with Misha Bilenko at Yandex about translation in Russia. Mm-hmm. And for both those countries, opening the English language internet to their citizenry is very important because so much information exists in English, and English is, unlike India, is not a primary language in their countries. It seems that would be a fantastic opportunity in India in a different way. Rather than opening to the English language world, just interconnecting the languages inside India. So in Russia, it's Yandex is doing that. Yeah. In China, it's Baidu and Tencent and Alibaba are the primary forces funding that kind of research. Obviously in the U.S., we know who the players are. Who would be in the private sector? Who would be funding that kind of research?
Right. So I guess kind of like in case of Russia, you have Russian. In case of China, you have Chinese and Cantonese. So a very small number of major languages.
Right.
So I guess that helps in kind of focusing the resources and developing things quickly.
Right.
In India, the problem is a little bit more complicated because the space is much more fragmented in terms of languages. Yeah. Right. While say there are few major languages like Hindi, Bangla, Tamil and all, but then there's a long tail of large number of languages. I mean, even in my mother tongue Assamese, right? So which is kind of maybe come towards the middle of the language pack that has 26 million plus speakers, right? So that kind of divides the focus, right? So in terms of what do you go after, right? So in terms of, I kind of see, I guess e-commerce players kind of doing investing more resources in developing these local language technologies with proliferation of personal assistants where it's much natural for people to kind of speak in their local language and get information needs satisfied. So I see these large players because mobile is taken over, right? And then having these kind of personal assistants on mobile devices is a natural choice, and that's where kind of things are evolving. So I see also these large companies, right? So who Apple's, Google, who have these personal assistants, Amazon with their Alexa, to cater to this larger population base, kind of investing in these types of
right. So there isn't a homegrown personal assistant yet that's dominating the market. I mean, Alice in Russia.
Right. Yeah. So not kind of at a well-recognized level yet. Yeah.
Are any of the big U.S. multinational tech players focusing on the long tail?
At least in the, I guess, the head and the torso of that language pack. Yeah. So I do see, at least for the first, say, top 5, top 10 languages, Microsoft has been investing in developing local language technologies. I hear also Apple, Amazon, Google kind of investing in.
Yeah.
Google has this next billion user initiative, which is to kind of take it to the next set of population, which have all of these additional.
Yeah, I just had an interview with Yen LeCun, and he was talking about this problem for Facebook because there are all these language pairs that are not parallel. The data sets are not.
It's not parallel, yes, or comparable.
Yeah, so it's an issue they're struggling with. Right. How do you translate between these
different
language
languages.
sets where you don't have a data set where things are already lined up?
In India, traditionally, people have collected these kind of data sets. For example, the parliamentary proceedings are parallelly translated to most of the major languages. But all of the data is in silos and kind of not accessible for research. But there are ongoing efforts to organize all of the data and make it more publicly available.
Well, that's very interesting because, again, the U.S. struggles or is beginning to struggle with data access because of privacy laws. And I can see China has kind of free reign because there's this industrial government fusion, and not that there are no privacy laws in China, but it's much easier to access government-collected data. Yeah. So that would be a constraint in India.
Right. So definitely the privacy is definitely of paramount importance. But the data sets that I was talking about, so these are kind of public data already, right? So parliamentary proceedings and all that you are already kind of translating and I guess just storing it and archiving it, but that's kind of all in government silos and not readily accessible. So the ongoing effort is to kind of surface all of those things, which is public data, nothing personally identifiable.
Yeah.
In them.
So the reason it's siloed is simply outdated technology or policy or.
It's kind of also the need. So where kind of enough people were asking and demanding for this type of data, which clearly is changing from what was before, right? Yeah.
Another area that China is outstripping the U.S. is in autonomous vehicles. Again, because policy there is less constrained by the concerns of the private sector or the citizenry. I mean, the government sets a policy or backs pilot programs, for example, that the U.S. private sector has difficulty getting support for. How is the autonomous vehicle space in India?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, there is kind of like, I mean, I don't know whether you have been to India, but our roads tend to be much more chaotic.
Yeah, of course.
Right. Yeah. So that poses additional challenges for autonomous vehicles. But there is kind of like ongoing effort. So there is even like multiple startups in Bangalore. So there's a company called Ati Motors that actually is trying to develop autonomous trucks, which in certain like say restricted environments, maybe in like mining and all, could be kind of like, used where it might be dangerous for humans to work in. There have been also like data set creation. So in Intel and IIIT Hyderabad collaborated to create like an autonomous vehicle kind of like data sets suited towards like the Indian conditions. Mm-hmm. So I think there are kind of like ongoing efforts. So
right. And the biometric space, facial recognition, is that being implemented at a government level the way it is in the US and China? And is the research advancing in India?
So that data is not available for research, and it's kind of like purely used for like a delivery of a service and in a very restrictive manner. Also, the biometrics that's being collected is the iris scan and the fingerprints, but not necessarily like the facial recognition. So that kind of like, I guess, like restricts its use from say large-scale surveillance and things like that. So yes, I would say while that data set is quite large, but still right now it's being used in a very restrictive use case.
And that's a policy issue.
That's a policy,
yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And the same with health data. China has, although the health data is maybe not as high quality as it is in the U.S.,
right.
It's much more readily available to researchers than it is currently in the U.S. How does that?
Yeah, so in India, that's still, again, very fragmented. So like use of electronic health records is still in its infancy. I would say like maybe a few major hospitals in the big cities have started adopting EHRs over the last few years, but kind of like the vast majority of the country is still based on paper. There is no kind of like centralized or even digitized versions of those records. There is an effort called like the India Health Stack. So there is something called like an India Stack that's being kind of like done for various things. For example, for payments, there is like an unified payment processing network on which various startups can or various companies can offer services. So I guess like one at the government level that I have seen in India is that they are kind of like looking at creating frameworks over which a lot of additional services and offerings could be done. For example, like the payment network that I mentioned, it's called UPI. That's one example. Similarly, there is a part of that India stack called like the India Health Stack, right? So which will basically allow easier digitization and transmission of information across various whoever wants to participate in that network. So that's still in development. So that's not deployed yet, maybe in some limited capacities. But I guess we first need to get to a digitized state of those information before those could be utilized for research.
Are all of these constraints one of the reason, beyond economic incentives, are these constraints one of the reason why so many of the top Indian researchers choose to build their careers in the U.S.?
Historically, I guess that was very much the case because there wasn't enough ecosystem and opportunities back home to consume their expertise, right? So where they could actually flourish and do interesting work. But I think that is changing. With development of, penetration of technology, the support from the government and the local ecosystem overall advancing in multiple ways, I think there are lots of interesting opportunities now.
Yeah. Looking probably 30 years ago or 25 years ago, everyone was talking about the BRICS, right. Brazil, Russia, India, China. Right. I spent most of the intervening years in China, and clearly all of those expectations have come true for China, not for Brazil, Russia, and India. Is there a concern in India, as I have heard that there is in Europe, certainly there is in Africa, there is to some degree in Russia, that they're falling behind the U.S. and China in artificial intelligence or machine learning development?
So, I think there is clear recognition that we need to kind of like do more and that we can do more, right? So I think there is kind of like realization of that, right? And definitely kind of like given the size and the opportunities that are there in front of the country, the level it is at right now, that definitely is suboptimal, right? And I think everyone recognizes that like, we need to do more, and various efforts towards that direction is kind of like ongoing,
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your research. You've worked on never-ending learning, which I find fascinating. Have you carried that research back to India?
Yes, yeah. So I started kind of working on never-ending learning when I joined Tom's group back in Carnegie Mellon in 2011. So I was there from 2011 to 2014. Then I moved back to India in 2014 to start my faculty position in the Institute of Science. And we have continued doing that line of research, which I think is kind of like the next frontier, because the way learning is practiced right now, machine learning is practiced right now, that's very myopic, and you try to learn like, one particular task or one function in isolation. And you kind of like, if you're fortunate, you get lots of data for that particular problem and you try to learn there, right? So if you move to something else, you kind of like abandon that completely and then like start from scratch. So that for certain high value problem, that might be okay, but that's very different from how you and I learn, right? So where our learning is not just focused on a few minutes or few hours of training. So it starts right in the womb and continues till we die. And whatever we had learned in the past, we utilize all of that knowledge to learn going forward. So those are kind of like the goals of never-ending learning. So how we can learn over extended periods of time and utilize whatever we learned in the past to learn things in the future better. So the never-ending language learning, so that's NEL with one more L, is one instantiation of that never-ending learning kind of like the philosophy of learning. So once I moved back to India, we collaborate quite a lot with industry. And one of the things that came up again and again was like, whether they could build a knowledge model, which is domain specific, right? So let's say you have data from automobile industry or from like biomedical domain, how you could quickly build a model for that particular domain. The reason for doing that is we want to make machine learning more knowledgeable, right? So we want to build the models not just based on the training data that we have for that particular specific task, but how we can sense the world better and utilize all of that external knowledge to make this particular learning task faster. And the hope is that if you're able to exploit those external knowledge, then maybe you can cut down on the amount of training that will be necessary to learn this particular task better. Because the hope is if you are more knowledgeable, you can become better learners quickly, right? So that way, if you want to build like a learning agent for a particular domain, so having that domain's knowledge is important. So one question is, how do you encode all of that knowledge, right? So one possibility could be that like, for our communications already, we are generating all of this data through documents to like, inform each other, for humans, whether we can read all of that data, right, automatically and build these kind of domain specific knowledge bases. So that's something we have been looking at. So maybe starting with a generic broad coverage knowledge base, how we can quickly deep dive into a particular domain and capture that particular domain's knowledge better.
Yeah, I want to do a separate episode on NEL, but is it one system, one block of code, a million lines long or something? I mean, what is NEL as an object?
Right. It has like evolved over time. I mean, at the end of the day, it still is a research system where like multiple PhD theses have come out and different students and researchers have like contributed towards its development. So there are like different, if you look at the architecture diagram, there are like different blocks in its working, and those different blocks are developed by different subgroups and different sets of researchers.
But they
but
work
they
together.
all interact together.
Yeah.
Yes. So at the end of the day, it's a one single system with multiple components inside it.
And have you ported that over to India, or do you communicate with it remotely, or how do you work with it?
Yeah, I mean, we have an instance of that, and we have tried to use that for specific domains, to instantiate that for specific domains. But we also have an effort on our own called INEL, which stands for India-Centric Never-Ending Language Learning, where we are trying to build a knowledge graph that's kind of like rich with Indian entities and relationships. So you can think of India as a domain on its own, so maybe like a larger and a diffuse domain, but the idea is to kind of like capture knowledge about that geography and the entities and objects that are active in that particular space.
That's fascinating. And the idea is this network of blocks will continue to grow and will continue to accumulate
knowledge.
Data and knowledge.
That's right. Yes. These agents are still not talking with each other. I mean, these blocks are within one particular agent. But as we were talking in the tutorial, how do you build like a cooperative community of these agents, which are, say, independently working in their own environments, building knowledge, and then maybe like, sharing notes with each other to improve each other's performance. So that's, I think, is kind of like an open question how to do that, but that's a very interesting one.
Yeah. And for this work in India, do you have adequate computing power?
Right. So I guess with cloud computing and also like computing has become democratized, right? Mm-hmm. And you have easy access as long as the resources to access those are there, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's expensive.
It's expensive, yeah. So that way there are kind of like grants. So we build our own infrastructure at an university level. But then there are also like grants from various companies, as like cloud credits, which we utilize.
So going back to kind of the overview, is compute a constraint in India?
I would say kind of like in the well-funded groups, it's not a constraint as much, but definitely it's expensive, right? Yeah. So you have to find a way to kind of support that, either through funding or cloud credits and all. But this kind of the supercomputing mission that I was talking about is trying to create a computing fabric inside the country where it will be much more accessible in maybe a government-supported way so that you don't have to rely on other expensive options.
Can you give us a vision of where you want INEL to go in 5 years, what it'll be able to do?
Right. I guess we would kind of want to go towards a situation where we are able to quickly capture the knowledge in a particular, at least in some specific restricted way about knowledge about a particular domain fairly quickly, and then utilize that knowledge to improve learning agents, right? So maybe to cut down on their amount of training that's necessary or improve their accuracy at similar comparable amounts of training data. I envision a situation where the humans and the machine, right? So there's this kind of learning agents are able to converse with each other and are able to kind of exploit and build on each other's strengths. For example, right now, the way machine learning is practiced and we provide supervision is very limited in terms of the training data that we provide, right? So which is kind of label instances. So we are looking at how we can expand that bandwidth and provide more supervision that's expressed through natural language so that it's not restricted to only the experts to train these agents, but a common person through this kind of a conversational interface will be able to train these kind of agents. So we want the agents to be and learning agents to be more knowledgeable so that they can have intelligent conversations with humans and learn in that process, right? So that's kind of the overall vision where we want to quickly bootstrap learners in a particular domain, utilizing various forms of weak signals that are kind of already available.
And the hope would be that would reach the long tail at some point.
So my research has been kind of how we can learn from weak forms of supervision, right? So that's kind of maybe already is naturally occurring that may not have been prepared, keeping this task that I'm trying to learn in mind, but how we could utilize all of those things to learn this particular task better, right? So all of those are kind of geared towards and relevant for how we can take it to the long tail, because the idea is to bootstrap learners and these kind of agents quickly in situations where you don't have too much supervision, right? So which doesn't exist and may not be practical to create all of those large data sets in the short span of time in which we want to build these agents. So leveraging whatever weak signals you have becomes important, which could be not only from text, but also maybe from other modalities. So all of these things are very relevant towards how we can adapt these learning agents toward less supervised settings. In terms of summary for India, so I guess there is optimism. There are lots of opportunities in front of us, which is not borrowed opportunities, right? So these are actually important opportunities to solve problems inside the country, right? So we can use AI as a tool, AI and technology more broadly, to leapfrog and provide those services and think differently than what way it has been approached so far. We certainly need to do more than what has been going on, right? We haven't, again, it has been more organic growth so far. There are initial attempts in having policies around them. I guess things in places like India have developed that way, right? So where there is momentum and then government comes in rather than doing it the other way around. So I think that involvement is starting to come in, but I would like to see more actual policies and funds being allocated to these problems and projects and make sure that those are executed properly.
That raises another question that I didn't ask. In China and in the U.S., national security or the military or the defense departments or however you want to label them have been a tremendous driver of that kind of research because they're clear national security implications and applications. Does that exist in India as well?
Right. So India, the defense departments have their own research labs. So most of their research they have done within their own labs. Right. I would say there hasn't been traditionally this strong tie-up between the military and governments. The DARPA model doesn't exist as efficiently as it does in US. And only I would say restricted amounts of research that they were not doing in the labs. But now maybe because of both the opportunities and the amount of talent that's available in-house, people are, I think, looking more broadly. To tap into the talent base.
I would think, though, that the military in India would have difficulty attracting the kind of talent they need to do very significant things.
So that's actually quite interesting because, you may have heard of ISRO, which is the Indian Space Research Organization. They have been able to do very, very impressive things in terms of having an orbiter to moon, to Mars in first attempt with all homegrown talent, right? So it's I guess attracting top tier talent is a challenge everywhere, and defense establishments are not an exception to that.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I really appreciate it, and I'll be watching your work.
Thank you.
Eager to see how iNL develops and India in general. And
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, great. That's it for this week's podcast. I want to thank Partha for his time. For those of you who want to go at a greater depth about the things we talked about today, you can find a transcript of this show in the program notes. If you don't see it, visit i-on.ai and you'll find a link for it there. We've been getting good feedback from listeners, and I hope to hear from more of you. I wanted to thank Tom Koppel this week for his valuable advice. Let us know whether you find the podcast interesting or useful and whether you have any suggestions about how we can improve. The singularity may not be near, but AI is about to change your world. So best pay attention.
I can't get close till I buy my time.